Hi, welcome to Cubs in Culture for March 25th, 2018. It's going to be our first exploration of Alexander Payne's filmography. I'm going to use Alexander Payne's filmography as sort of an example to explore this question. And it didn't come up today, but I was been thinking about this for the last, month or something about classification of films, because kind of the last couple of years you have famously had two different films, The Martian, which I think I misspelled. Yeah, there you go. Which Golden Globes, the Golden Globes ruled it was a comedy. And then you had Get Out, which was also ruled a comedy, and there's a whole bunch of people who was annoyed at this. And matter of fact, the Golden Globes actually, if I can just show you real quick, they actually changed their rules because of the controversy around The Martian. Now, so the thing is, I might be the only person on Earth, so I'm going to use Alexander Payne's filmography as a way of exploring this question of, well, what is a comedy? Because Alexander Payne's films ultimately really straddle the line very, very well between drama and comedy. And they're not just dramedies in that there have elements of both. It's really are sort of comedic dramas or dramatic comedies where it's not just that it has elements of both. It's that basically simultaneously scenes are turning as both comedic and for dramatic. Okay, so there's that. So there's this. The first thing I want to talk about is let's look up Vixen. Vixen is a female fox, right? Because that's what defining it is. And so there's this notion in philosophy called necessary and sufficient, which is the old way of defining things. And so if you look at this Venn diagram right here, that for a vixen, it's for an object to be a vixen, it has to be both a female and a fox. And so there's the necessary and sufficient conditions. And that for a long time in philosophy, the necessary and sufficient conditions, trying to find them, were the goal of defining things. That you define something was this object fits this definition if it has this necessary condition and this sufficient condition. So, like, for example, in all Platonic dialogues, there is, in all Platonic dialogues, it's basically when he goes around, like, asking a general to define courage, or asking Euthyphro, the piety, having used for to define piety, what he's ultimately asking for, Socrates is asking for the necessary and sufficient conditions for whatever word he's trying to define. And then there's this other man named Wittgenstein, who's a philosopher, and he pointed out that his example is games, because if you look at, like, baseball's a game, and Mass Effect is a game, and wrestling is a game, or bridge is a game, or Scrabble's a game, and we have all these things, that we call games. But what is the sort of the definition of game? What is the necessary and sufficient conditions? What do baseball and, I don't know, solitaire, right? They're both games. What do you call, what characteristics, what is the necessary and sufficient conditions? And he ultimately argues that there aren't any sort of necessary and sufficient conditions for things like games. That it's actually more like an overlapping set of criteria which kind of sort of go through a lot of them, but not all of them, and sort of a more like the things are grouped together in groupings because they resemble each other in some ways, but not in others. So like family, like the metaphor here is sort of like family resemblance, that you can always tell, like, my sister and I really look like each other because we have a family resemblance, but neither one of us really look like our brother. But my brother looks like my mother, but I kind of look like my mother as well, if you're trying to get what I'm saying. So it's that sort of thing. And ultimately, I think for definitions, it's never really this necessary and sufficient conditions. It's this overlapping set of family resemblance. And so I'm bringing this up because I will admit, so I'm going to use Alexander Payne's filmography. Let me just quickly bring up his tomato meter. Give me a second. As an example of comedies. One, Alexander Payne, every single film he's ever made. Well, not every single film he's made, because he's done things like I Now Pronounce You Chuck and Larry, but every single film he's directed that I have seen, I've really, really enjoyed. This is him. His most famous work is Sideways. So I'm going to do a little bit on Sideways, About Schmidt, The Descendants, and Nebraska, probably in that order. I have not seen Downsizing. It's really sort of his only bad film. He also wrote Jurassic Park 3, so he could basically make Sideways and About Schmidt, which is sort of amusing to me. So there's that. And now the reason why I'm doing this is ultimately at the end, because there was this huge controversy about The Martian winning the Golden Globe Award for Best Comedy. And the thing is, I want to give a review of The Martian. A review of The Martian as sort of the last segment, because I'm going to argue that the Golden Globes inadvertently correctly classified The Martian as a comedy. And so I want to talk about Alexander Payne, because the way in which his films are often classified are kind of funny to me, because they bounce back and forth between the comedy and drama definitions. Let me try to find the Golden Globes. Oops, I just missed. Anyway, I'm just giving you some visuals. Golden Derby. Maybe it was up here. There it is. Yeah, see, so Matt Damon one was the nominee for comedy and musical. Anyway, so let me first start doing sort of this sort of definition. Okay, so if you just talk about like necessary and sufficient conditions, let's look at comedy, right? Consisting of jokes intending to make an audience laugh. Okay, the thing is, intending to make an audience laugh. It doesn't really so laugh when, right? Because there's also, or laugh, what does laugh mean? Well, we laugh when something is funny, right? Right, but we also use unusual or odd or curious or difficult to explain or strange, right? If you look at like humorous, I'm misspelling that. No, it's hummus. Humor. Here it is. Lighthouse, amusement, comedic, right? So they all sort of, right? But if you go to things like witty is quick in verbal humor, puns, or if you go to like droll, curious or unusual way that provokes dry amusement, right? So there's all series of these words that all sort of end up defining each other. Humorous causes laughter. Laughter is things which are witty, something which are like jocular, which is like boastful or louder, etc. So like, yeah, a comedy is a film which is intended for you to laugh at it in some sense. And I think ultimately a better way of looking at what's comedic is, and I'm sure, is whether or not the film is poking at absurdity in some way. Right? Because if we go to absurd, we get things like ridiculous or ludicrous or farcical, which is like a farce, right? And a farce is a form of comedy, right? Because a farce, you just go here. A comedic that uses buffoonery and horseplay, typically crude characterization, and ludicrously improbable situations. So it's like the burlesque or vaudeville, etc. And so the thing is, and I think Alexander Payne's films fit this, is he ultimately sort of picks on the sort of the absurdity of life as sort of his main theme of what he's working on. And so I'm going to use his films as the example of these works because the Golden Globes divide films into dramas, into comedies, and it's not really bifurcated in that way. It's really hard to sort of separate because there are times in which comedic works are comedic because they're pointing at like oddity or the absurdity of life. And I think Alexander Payne's films are like this because even though a lot of them have a lot of laugh out loud moments, often they are funny to think about and you laugh not while watching them. And I think The Martian works like this as well. So the other point I want to talk about real quickly, connected to this about sort of like defining genre or just doing the bifurcation of comedy versus drama or serious thing is a lot of people seem to think incorrectly that that to call something a comedy is to say it's inherently sort of frivolous or not meaningful or has no value outside of like being able to laugh at it, or it's just entertainment. Now don't get me wrong, there are absolutely comedic films which are frivolous, lighthearted, absolutely no politics, etc., that they're not really meaningful in any sort of thing, in any sort of way, that they are the sort of cinematic version of a Big Mac or whatever. But the thing is, if you just look at value, what we say, there's this whole issue in aesthetics, whether or not you should value films for what they're doing as opposed to just for their own sake. But the thing is, value doesn't mean seriousness. It means usefulness, that something is valuable because it's useful. We clearly need to laugh, and we clearly need to grapple with comedic elements or comedic themes in existence, because not only like comedy is such a common thing, even in dramatic works which are predominantly dramatic still have a joke or two in them. Likewise, if you look at something like seriousness, it doesn't seriousness is sort of the opposite of humorous, in that it demands careful consideration and application, or it's about it's not joking or half-hearted. It's you're being serious, but that doesn't translate into being meaningful, right? Because meaningful or worthwhile is just, it's worth the money or it's of value, so it's about its usefulness. Okay, something does not need to be serious for it to be worthwhile or useful. Okay, and that's sort of the thing. So comedies in general are sort of devalued critically and sort of culturally, because people seem to think, oh, it's just a comedy. But the thing is, I'm going to talk about 6 movies very, very briefly to sort of talk about this. And the first 3 are clearly dramas, even though they all have sort of elements of have moments of humor in them. And the last 3 are also clearly comedies, even though all of them have serious moments of them in them. Okay, and the reason I'm picking these 6 movies is I happen to like them all, but I think they're also on varying levels of sort of engagement and sort of meaningfulness or seriousness. Okay, so the first one up is Doctor Strange, which happens to be my favorite MCU Marvel film. And this movie is it's basically a hero's quest movie about a doctor who loses his hands, blah blah blah, and becomes a magician or mysticism. And there's nothing super serious about this movie, and it's like its metaphysics are a mishmash. It has sort of like 1930s style racism in it because of the way in which the Ancient One is sort of exotified, etc., etc., etc. And here's the thing: I think it's a very good movie. It's a deeply entertaining film. It's clearly a genre. It's clearly a drama, or clearly a drama, because it is structured. It's not a comedic work. It's not grappling with the absurd. It's an action film, okay? And it's trying to have tension and suspense, okay? Now, we move on to the next one, which is Die Hard from 1998. This one is still a dramatic work, and it's slightly more serious than Doctor Strange, because it has issues of international terrorism. It has sort of issues of family relationship, because it's at Christmas, and then the main character is set up as a conflict with his wife, etc. And then also it's much more influential film than Doctor Strange at this point, because just for the opposite example, Hans Gruber, the bad guy, is going off the side of a building, i.e. Hans Gruber is copied a lot, etc. Still, it's not a particularly serious film. It's not sort of grappling with big themes or anything like that. Moving on, Raiders of the Lost Ark from 1981. This film, again, it's clearly a drama. It's clearly an action film. It's not comedic, even though there's some funny moments in it. There is sort of issues of like colonialism, and then there's issues of Nazis, and then etc. Even though it's not really a fully serious treatment of Nazism or anything like that, it connects to history in sort of a much more substantially real way than Die Hard, but it's still not ultimately a particularly serious film, etc. And please note, I'm not saying these are bad films. They're really good films. How the hell did I end up on IMDb for Raiders of the Lost Ark? Anyway, it's talking about some levels of seriousness. Okay, moving on now. Then you have Bride of Frankenstein, which is clearly comedic, and I think this film is far more serious than any of the 3 dramas I just listed. And the main reason why is, I'm sure I've talked about this before, and I will eventually do a review of Bride of Frankenstein directly, is Bride of Frankenstein is a Christ allegory. The monster is turned into a Christ figure, and the allegory runs backwards. So he's resurrected, then crucified, then arrested, then has his Last Supper. Which is both ironically, but also because it's dealing with like themes of outsiders, etc. It's a deeply funny film. It's a very serious film when you realize it's sort of the first ode to outsiders, and it sort of takes deep religious themes and flips them on their head. etc. And that's just one aspect of it. So it's far more serious. It's a far deeper film than the three I just mentioned, just because of the Christ allegory. Okay? Then, moving on to much more serious, but still clearly comedic. You might debate about the movie because it's a Tim Burton film, but Sweeney Todd, the underlying material, is sort of a cultural anxiety manifestation about capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, etc. Then it has issues of like revenge and corruption and everything like that. It's a very deeply cynical view of what's happening in capitalism for the last 300 years. It's also a very biting social satire, and that, you know, man devouring man, my dear, etc. And then finally, in terms of sort of the most serious film, but also clearly a comedy, or I shouldn't be serious. Serious is not quite the word I'm looking for. Meaningful or deep or socially relevant, etc., is Cabaret. And this is, of the films of my spectrum, this is the most sort of biting and socially important film, because Cabaret is Sweeney Todd is a social commentary. Cabaret is a social commentary about a specific moment about the intelligentsia being too distracted by frivolous entertainment to recognize the threat of what the Nazis were about to do in Germany in the 1920s and 30s. And because it's that specific of a indictment against, again, sort of the intelligentsia, the Weimar Republic, and unleashing this horrible thing of the World War II and the Holocaust, it's an incredibly, profoundly important work, despite or because of it being comedic. Okay, and that's just sort of like the base level of Cabaret, because it also functions as a sort of a platonic discussion of how democracy leads to tyranny and how the decadent society collapses and falls apart, etc. Okay, so that's going to be it for Cups and Culture for today. I will get to About Schmidt tomorrow. I started the review there. So have a good night. Cups and Culture out.